Welcome to Unsolved Historical Mysteries. The Missing 200 Years, the Mystery of the Phantom Decades. Introduction. 1. The Mystery of the Phantom Time Hypothesis. What if the calendar we've relied on for centuries isn't as accurate as we think? Imagine this: 200 years of history. An entire era, fabricated, erased, or never even existed. This idea, known as the phantom time hypothesis, has sparked curiosity and debate among scholars and conspiracy enthusiasts alike. The hypothesis suggests that a significant portion of the Middle Ages, specifically from the year 614 to 911 AD, never happened. This means iconic events, such as Charlemagne's reign and pivotal moments in European history, might be nothing more than myth. The implications of this theory are profound. If true, we aren't living in the year 2024 but closer to 1724. This notion challenges not only the timeline of human history, but also our understanding of how history itself is recorded. The roots of this idea trace back to German historian Heribert Illig, who proposed it in the 1990s. Illig argued that inaccuracies in historical records, combined with a deliberate alteration of the calendar by powerful figures, have distorted our perception of the past. But why would anyone go to such lengths to fabricate centuries of history? Was it to align with political agendas, consolidate power, or rewrite inconvenient truths? Critics of the hypothesis are quick to dismiss it, citing archaeological evidence, scientific dating methods, and logical inconsistencies. However, the theory has found a niche following, with its proponents pointing to what they believe are glaring gaps in historical records, questionable chronology, and astronomical discrepancies that hint at something being amiss. As we unravel this mystery, we'll explore the key claims of the phantom time hypothesis and delve into the motivations and evidence behind it. This journey will challenge not just what we know about the Middle Ages, but also the very foundation of our historical timeline. So, are you ready to dive into one of history's most intriguing mysteries? Let's begin. 2. The claim that 200 years in the Middle Ages were fabricated. At the heart of the phantom time hypothesis lies an audacious claim. 200 years of the Middle Ages, spanning from 614 to 911 AD, were entirely fabricated. According to this theory, the historical records we've come to trust have been deliberately altered to insert these non-existent centuries into our timeline. But how could such a massive deception be carried out, and why? The theory suggests that powerful figures in medieval Europe, namely Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, conspired to rewrite history. Allegedly, Otto III wanted to legitimize his reign by placing himself in the symbolic year 1000 AD, a milestone year in Christian eschatology. To achieve this, he and his allies fabricated the necessary centuries to align the current year with this significant date. By doing so, they reinforced their authority and tied their rule to a divine timeline. Supporters of the hypothesis point to several pieces of evidence they believe validate this claim. For example, they argue that there is a lack of substantial archaeological findings from this period. Structures, artifacts, and records that should date back to these centuries are either sparse or entirely absent. This, they claim, suggests that these years were retroactively added to historical timelines rather than actually experienced by those living in the era. Another intriguing argument centers around discrepancies in astronomical records. Proponents note that certain celestial events, such as eclipses and planetary alignments described in historical texts, do not align with calculations based on modern astronomical data. This discrepancy has led some to conclude that these events were fabricated or inaccurately recorded to fit the altered timeline. However, critics of the hypothesis are quick to counter these claims. They point out that there is no direct evidence of a conspiracy, and the idea of rewriting 200 years of history on such a grand scale would have been logistically impossible. Additionally, archaeological findings from the alleged phantom period, such as coins, documents, and structures, do exist, albeit with varying degrees of preservation. Despite its controversial nature, the claim that 200 years of history were fabricated has captured the imagination of many. Whether you see it as an audacious conspiracy or a fascinating mental exercise, one thing is certain: it forces us to question how history is recorded, interpreted, and manipulated. Could it be possible that the Middle Ages were, in part, an illusion? 3. Key questions to explore. Is this true, and why? The phantom time hypothesis raises some fundamental questions about how we perceive and verify history. If 200 years of the Middle Ages were indeed fabricated, how could such a monumental deception go unnoticed for so long? And why would anyone undertake such an elaborate conspiracy in the first place? To address these questions, we must examine both the evidence supporting the hypothesis and the motivations behind it. First, let's consider the claim itself. Is there any concrete proof that these years were fabricated? Proponents of the theory argue that certain anomalies in the historical record suggest something unusual. For instance, they point to gaps in medieval documentation, where few significant events or advancements are recorded. These quiet centuries stand out when compared to other, more dynamic periods of history. Could this be evidence of fabricated time? Or is it simply a result of limited record-keeping during an era of political and social upheaval? Astronomical inconsistencies are another key area of debate. Historical accounts of celestial events, such as eclipses, have been cross-referenced with modern calculations. While most align with our current understanding of the calendar, a few discrepancies have been highlighted by supporters of the hypothesis. These mismatches, they argue, could indicate that adjustments were made to the timeline to fit a fabricated narrative. But if this theory were true, what purpose would it serve? The motivations proposed by theorists often center around power and control. For instance, aligning the calendar to place Otto III's reign in the year 1000 AD would have given him symbolic legitimacy as a ruler, chosen by divine providence. Similarly, Pope Sylvester II, a key figure in the hypothesis, could have supported such a scheme to strengthen the Church's authority over time itself. By anchoring their leadership in a carefully crafted timeline, these figures could consolidate power and rewrite history to suit their agendas. Yet this leads to another question: why would such a conspiracy not be widely exposed? Historians argue that the logistical challenge of altering an entire calendar system across Europe would have been insurmountable. Moreover, any attempt to erase or fabricate 200 years would require tampering with countless historical records, including those from different cultures and regions, many of which have no connection to Europe. Could a conspiracy of this magnitude really succeed? Or is it more likely a modern interpretation of ancient inconsistencies? The search for answers is what makes this mystery so compelling. While we may never know for certain whether the phantom time hypothesis holds any truth, exploring these questions forces us to think critically about the construction of history. How much of what we accept as fact is shaped by the biases, mistakes, or agendas of those who recorded it? As we move forward in this video, we'll examine the hypothesis in greater detail, presenting both the evidence for and against it. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the debate. 1. What is the phantom time hypothesis? 1. Heribert Illig's theory and the proposed timeline 614 to 911 AD. To truly understand the phantom time hypothesis, we need to start with its origins. The theory was first proposed by Heribert Illig, a German historian, in the late 20th century. Illig's argument is as bold as it is controversial. The years between 614 and 911 AD, nearly 300 years, were fabricated, and the events supposedly occurring during that period, including much of early medieval European history, never actually happened. Illig's work centers on discrepancies he perceived in the historical record, particularly in the timeline of the early Middle Ages. He believed there was something off about the way events were recorded and the flow of history during this time. For instance, he noted a lack of substantial cultural or technological progress in the so-called Dark Ages. This stagnation, he argued, was suspicious, and pointed to the possibility that these centuries were invented rather than experienced. According to Illig, the culprits behind this grand deception were none other than Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Allegedly, Otto III had a personal motive to align his reign with the symbolic year 1000 AD, a year of immense religious and cultural significance. By adjusting the calendar and inserting phantom years, Otto and his collaborators could position themselves as rulers at the dawn of a new millennium, thereby strengthening their claims to power. The timeline Illig proposed, spanning from 614 to 911 AD, includes several significant historical figures and events, most notably, the reign of Charlemagne, one of Europe's most celebrated rulers, falls entirely within this phantom period. If Illig's theory is correct, this would mean that Charlemagne himself, along with his legendary exploits and reforms, might be little more than a mythological construct created to fill the fabricated gap. Illig also pointed to inconsistencies in architectural history as evidence for his theory. He claimed that there was an unusual lack of building activity during the supposed phantom centuries, particularly in comparison to other periods of history. Structures and monuments that should have been built during this time are either missing or do not match the technological capabilities of the era, according to Illig's analysis. Another cornerstone of Illig's argument lies in the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. This reform, introduced by Pope Gregory XIII, corrected the Julian calendar by removing 10 days to realign the calendar with the solar year. Illig, however, argued that the calendar should have been off by more than 13 days if the entire medieval timeline were accurate. He interpreted this as evidence that the 200 phantom years were inserted into the calendar, artificially shortening the discrepancy. While Illig's theory is undeniably intriguing, it's important to note that it has been met with widespread skepticism from historians, archaeologists, and scientists. Critics argue that the hypothesis relies heavily on speculative interpretations and fails to account for substantial evidence contradicting it. For example, archaeological discoveries from the period in question, such as coins, artifacts, and written records, strongly suggest that these centuries did, in fact, exist. Nonetheless, the phantom time hypothesis forces us to confront deeper questions about how we interpret and validate history. How much of what we know is based on assumptions rather than hard evidence? And could errors or manipulations in historical record-keeping be more common than we realize? These questions continue to fuel the debate around Illig's theory, making it one of the most provocative ideas in historical revisionism. 2. Evidence used by proponents of the hypothesis. Proponents of the phantom time hypothesis rely on a mix of historical, archaeological, and astronomical evidence to support their claim that 200 years of the Middle Ages were fabricated. While many historians view these arguments as speculative, those who believe in the theory argue that inconsistencies in the historical record are too significant to ignore. Let's take a closer look at some of the key pieces of evidence cited by supporters of this controversial idea. The first line of evidence concerns gaps in historical documentation. Supporters point out that the period between 614 and 911 AD, often referred to as part of the Dark Ages, is characterized by a notable lack of significant events, cultural advancements, or technological innovations. They argue that this absence is suspicious and may indicate that the period was fabricated rather than lived. For example, the supposed achievements of Charlemagne, the famed ruler of the Carolingian Empire, are often presented as extraordinary. Yet, Illig and others question whether these achievements could have been so impactful without leaving behind more substantial and consistent records. Another point raised by proponents is the lack of physical evidence, particularly architectural remains, from the phantom centuries. While some structures from this period do exist, supporters claim they are fewer in number compared to other historical eras. They also argue that many of these structures could have been misdated, belonging to either earlier or later periods. For instance, certain medieval churches and castles show signs of construction techniques that seem out of place for their supposed time, suggesting that their dates might have been adjusted to fit an artificial timeline. Astronomical discrepancies also play a crucial role in this debate. Proponents of the hypothesis have analyzed historical accounts of celestial events, such as solar and lunar eclipses, and compared them to modern astronomical models. In some cases, these accounts appear to deviate slightly from expected patterns, leading to questions about whether the timeline has been manipulated. For instance, a solar eclipse described in the 8th century might not align precisely with what modern calculations predict for that time. While these deviations could be attributed to errors in observation or recording, supporters argue they could also reflect a larger manipulation of history. One of the most frequently cited arguments involves the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the new calendar, it was meant to correct the drift of the Julian calendar, which had caused the calendar year to fall out of sync with the solar year. The correction involved removing 10 days to account for the discrepancy. However, Illig and other supporters of the phantom time hypothesis argue that if the medieval timeline were accurate, the drift would have been greater, around 13 days, because the Julian calendar would have been in use for longer. They interpret this as evidence that 200 years were artificially added to the calendar, shortening the total amount of drift. Finally, proponents point to anomalies in historical chronology. For instance, they argue that certain events in European, Byzantine, and Islamic history appear to overlap or mirror each other in suspicious ways, suggesting that some of these events may have been duplicated or altered to fit a fabricated timeline. They also highlight inconsistencies in the historical record, such as gaps in dynastic succession or abrupt changes in cultural trends, as potential signs of manipulation. While these arguments are fascinating, they are far from conclusive. Critics argue that gaps in historical documentation are not unusual, especially during times of political and social turmoil, like the early Middle Ages. Similarly, the perceived lack of physical evidence from the phantom centuries could be attributed to natural decay, war, or the limitations of archaeological methods. Astronomical discrepancies, they suggest, are more likely. the result of human error in recording celestial events than deliberate manipulation. Despite the skepticism surrounding the phantom time hypothesis, the evidence cited by its supporters continues to intrigue and challenge our understanding of history. Whether these anomalies are signs of a grand conspiracy, or simply the result of historical misunderstandings, they highlight the complexity of piecing together humanity's past. 3. The concept of a fabricated history. The idea of a fabricated history is not just a cornerstone of the phantom time hypothesis. It also taps into a broader and deeply unsettling question: how much of what we know about history is truly accurate? If a portion of history could be deliberately fabricated, it would imply that the very foundation of our understanding of the past is vulnerable to manipulation. Let's explore what this concept entails, and why it has captivated both historians and skeptics alike. At its core, the phantom time hypothesis suggests that the creation of a false historical timeline was not only possible but executed on a massive scale. This involves altering or inventing key historical events, characters, and even entire centuries to serve the agendas of those in power. In the context of the phantom time hypothesis, it is suggested that Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and their Byzantine counterparts had the means and motivation to rewrite history. By fabricating 200 years, they could align their rule with the symbolic year 1000 AD, a date imbued with apocalyptic and religious significance, reinforcing their divine legitimacy as rulers of the Christian world. This concept of fabricated history raises profound implications about the control of knowledge. Throughout history, powerful individuals and institutions have often acted as the gatekeepers of information. From ancient scribes to medieval monks, the recording of history has frequently been concentrated in the hands of a select few. This centralized control creates opportunities for distortion, whether intentional or accidental. If the phantom time hypothesis were true, it would demonstrate the immense influence that political and religious authorities wielded over the narrative of history. Supporters of the hypothesis often draw parallels to other instances of historical manipulation, both real and alleged. For example, the propaganda used by empires, the rewriting of history by victorious nations, or even the intentional destruction of records by conquering armies, all demonstrate how the historical narrative can be shaped by those in power. Fabricated history, in this sense, is not entirely without precedent. While the scale of the phantom time hypothesis is far greater than most examples, the concept itself aligns with known practices of historical revisionism. Another aspect of the hypothesis is the psychological and societal implications of fabricated history. For those who accept the theory, it forces a re-evaluation of the trust we place in historical sources. Many proponents argue that history, as we know it, is inherently subjective, shaped by the biases and agendas of its recorders. This skepticism extends to other areas, such as the dating of artifacts and the reliability of oral traditions. If 200 years of history can be fabricated, they ask, how much more of our historical timeline might be open to doubt? Critics, however, argue that the concept of a fabricated history on this scale is implausible. For one, the coordination required to alter records across multiple regions and cultures would have been extraordinary. Different civilizations, including Islamic and Byzantine empires, were keeping their own records during the proposed phantom centuries. Manipulating all these independent sources to create a consistent false narrative would have been a monumental task, far beyond the technological and logistical capabilities of the time. Furthermore, archaeological evidence stands as a significant counterpoint to the idea of fabricated history. Coins, manuscripts, and other artifacts dating to the alleged phantom centuries have been discovered and authenticated using modern scientific techniques, such as carbon dating and dendrochronology. These findings suggest that, while historical inaccuracies and biases certainly exist, the idea of inventing entire centuries of history is unlikely. Despite these objections, the concept of a fabricated history remains an intriguing thought experiment. It challenges us to think critically about the nature of historical truth and the processes by which it is constructed. If nothing else, it serves as a reminder that history is not a fixed and unchanging record, but a complex tapestry woven from countless sources, each with its own limitations and perspectives. As we move forward, the question remains, even if the phantom time hypothesis itself is debunked, could smaller-scale fabrications and revisions still have shaped the way we view the past? This idea of fabricated history invites us to scrutinize not only the Middle Ages, but every era of recorded history, reminding us that what we accept as fact may sometimes be closer to fiction. 2. Why would anyone fabricate 200 years? 1. Motives like political power and historical revisionism. To understand why anyone might fabricate 200 years of history, we must explore the potential motives behind such an audacious act. At the heart of the phantom time hypothesis lies the suggestion that this fabricated period was not an accident, but a deliberate manipulation by powerful figures. Supporters of the theory point to two primary motivations: the consolidation of political power and the manipulation of history, to serve the agendas of those in control. First, let's consider the role of political power. The Middle Ages were a time of dramatic shifts in authority, with kingdoms rising and falling, emperors competing for dominance, and the Church asserting itself as a central force in European society. In such an unstable environment, controlling the narrative of history was a potent tool. By aligning their reign with significant dates, such as the symbolic year 1000 AD, rulers could present themselves as divinely chosen leaders, positioned at pivotal moments in God's plan for humanity. This is where the theory implicates Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, a central figure in the hypothesis. According to proponents, Otto had a personal stake in rewriting the timeline. By fabricating 200 years and situating his reign in the year 1000 AD, he could tie his rule to apocalyptic prophecies and religious significance, which would strengthen his claim to the throne. The year 1000 was seen as a turning point in Christian eschatology, symbolizing the end of an era and the potential second coming of Christ. By placing himself in this critical moment, Otto III could present his reign as a fulfillment of divine will, thereby legitimizing his authority in the eyes of his subjects and rival rulers alike. The Church's role in this alleged manipulation is equally significant. Under the leadership of Pope Sylvester II, the Church held immense influence over the recording of history. Supporters of the phantom time hypothesis argue that the Church may have collaborated with Otto III to create a fabricated timeline that reinforced its own power. By aligning historical events with biblical narratives and prophecies, the Church could assert itself as the ultimate interpreter of divine history. This collaboration would not only secure Otto III's position, but also elevate the Church's authority over time itself, linking its influence to the unfolding of God's plan. Historical revisionism also plays a key role in the theory. The rewriting of history to suit the needs of those in power is not without precedent. Throughout history, victorious rulers have often destroyed or altered records to erase their enemies and glorify their reigns. The ancient Egyptians, for example, were known to deface monuments and remove the names of deposed pharaohs. Similarly, Medieval kings and chroniclers frequently exaggerated their victories or downplayed their defeats to bolster their legacies. The phantom time hypothesis takes this concept to an unprecedented scale, suggesting that entire centuries were fabricated to rewrite history on a monumental level. But why specifically 200 years? Proponents argue that this period was chosen strategically to align the timeline with certain religious and political milestones. The fabricated years were inserted into a relatively undocumented and tumultuous period of history, making it easier to disguise the deception. This period, often referred to as the Dark Ages, is characterized by sparse documentation, which supporters of the hypothesis claim creates the perfect opportunity for manipulation. By retroactively inserting a fabricated timeline into an already poorly documented era, the alleged conspirators could avoid raising immediate suspicion. Critics, of course, argue that such a massive alteration of history would be logistically impossible. The coordination required to implement this deception across multiple regions, cultures, and languages is staggering. Historical records from the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, and other independent civilizations during this period would also need to have been manipulated to create a cohesive narrative. Proponents counter that the dominance of the Holy Roman Empire and the Church in medieval Europe gave them the means to control the narrative within their sphere of influence, leaving other regions less affected by the alleged fabrication. While the idea of fabricating 200 years may seem far-fetched, it raises intriguing questions about the relationship between power and history. How much of what we know about the past is shaped by those who recorded it? And how often has history been rewritten to serve political or religious agendas? Whether or not the phantom time hypothesis holds any truth, it reminds us to approach the past with a critical eye, and to consider the motives of those who have shaped the stories we accept as fact. 2. Role of Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. At the center of the phantom time hypothesis is one of medieval Europe's most intriguing figures, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. According to proponents of the theory, Otto was not only aware of the alleged fabrication of 200 years, but played a leading role in orchestrating it. To understand his involvement, we need to explore his ambitions, his relationship with the Church, and the historical context of his reign. Otto III was born into a time of significant upheaval in the Holy Roman Empire. Crowned emperor at the age of 16 in 996 AD, Otto inherited a realm fraught with internal divisions and external threats. From the outset, he sought to assert his authority and legitimize his rule in a way that would not only stabilize his empire, but also secure his legacy as a divinely appointed leader. For Otto, aligning his reign with the year 1000 AD, a year steeped in religious and apocalyptic significance, was an opportunity to position himself as a ruler chosen by God at the dawn of a new millennium. In medieval Christian thought, the year 1000 was viewed as a turning point, potentially marking the second coming of Christ, or the beginning of the prophesied end times. By situating his reign in this symbolic year, Otto could capitalize on the millennial fervor of his time. It would enhance his divine legitimacy, bolster his authority, and elevate his image as a central figure in God's plan for humanity. According to the phantom time hypothesis, this desire to connect his rule to the year 1000 motivated Otto to conspire with key allies, including Pope Sylvester II, to fabricate 200 years of history. Proponents argue that Otto's collaboration with the Church was essential to this alleged scheme. At the time, the Church wielded immense influence over the recording and preservation of history, with its network of monasteries and scribes. The Church controlled much of Europe's historical narrative, making it a powerful partner in any effort to manipulate the timeline. Otto and Sylvester II, who shared a close relationship, allegedly worked together to insert the fabricated centuries into the calendar, effectively creating a phantom period of history. This collaboration served both Otto's political ambitions and the Church's spiritual agenda. For Otto, the fabricated timeline allowed him to align his reign with the symbolic year 1000, while for the Church, it reinforced its authority as the interpreter of divine history. By embedding the fabricated years into an already poorly documented period, the so-called Dark Ages, the alleged conspirators could conceal their deception and ensure it went unchallenged for centuries. Supporters of the hypothesis also point to Otto's broader vision for the Holy Roman Empire as evidence of his potential involvement. Otto envisioned a renewed Roman Empire, centered in Germany and deeply intertwined with the Church. He sought to model his rule on the legacy of ancient Rome, blending political and religious authority in a way that would elevate the Holy Roman Empire to unprecedented heights. Fabricating 200 years to align with this vision, they argue, would not have been out of character for a ruler as ambitious and visionary as Otto III. Critics, however, dismiss these claims as speculative and historically implausible. They argue that there is no concrete evidence linking Otto to any such conspiracy. While it is true that Otto was a devout and politically astute ruler, the idea that he could orchestrate a fabrication of this magnitude is seen as far-fetched. For one, the coordination required to implement this scheme across Europe would have been staggering. Historical records from other regions, such as Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphates, would also have needed to be altered to maintain consistency, a task well beyond the capabilities of any medieval ruler. Additionally, Otto's reign was marked by significant challenges that would have made such a scheme difficult to prioritize. His empire faced constant threats from internal revolts and external enemies, leaving little room for the kind of large-scale manipulation proposed by the hypothesis. Furthermore, modern historians argue that the supposed gaps in the historical record during the phantom centuries can be explained by other factors, such as limited documentation and the natural decay of historical artifacts over time. Despite these objections, the idea of Otto III as a central figure in the phantom time hypothesis remains a captivating narrative. It paints a picture of a ruler whose ambition extended not only to the control of his empire, but to the shaping of history itself. Whether or not the theory holds any truth, it highlights the complex interplay between politics, religion, and historical narrative in the medieval world. Could Otto III really have been the architect of a fabricated timeline? Or is his involvement simply a fascinating myth, born out of the gaps and mysteries of history? Either way, his role in this theory continues to fuel debate and intrigue, reminding us of the power of history to shape our understanding of the past and the figures who sought to control it. 3. Role of Pope Sylvester II. Pope Sylvester II, one of the most intriguing figures in medieval history, plays a pivotal role in the phantom time hypothesis. Known as the Scholar Pope, Sylvester II was a highly educated and ambitious leader who brought unprecedented intellectual and scientific advancements to the papacy. According to proponents of the hypothesis, Sylvester was not only a partner in the alleged fabrication of 200 years, but also one of its masterminds. His influence, both as a religious leader and a scholar, made him a key player in this supposed conspiracy. Born Gerbert of Aurillac in 946 AD, Sylvester II rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most learned men of his time. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, earning a reputation as a brilliant mind. His knowledge of science and technology was so advanced that legends emerged, accusing him of dabbling in sorcery and making a pact with the devil. These tales, while fantastical, reflect his unique status in an era often characterized by intellectual stagnation. Proponents of the phantom time hypothesis argue that Sylvester's intellect and position within the church gave him the tools necessary to orchestrate the fabrication of 200 years. As the leader of the Catholic Church, he wielded immense influence over the recording of history. Monasteries and religious institutions, which were responsible for preserving historical records, were under the Church's control, making it possible for Sylvester to coordinate the insertion of fabricated centuries into the timeline. One of the key motivations attributed to Sylvester II is the alignment of the timeline with Christian eschatology. The year 1000 AD held profound significance in medieval Christianity, symbolizing the potential end of the world and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. By collaborating with Holy Roman Emperor Otto III to fabricate the phantom years, Sylvester could position the Church at the heart of a divinely orchestrated historical narrative. This would reinforce the Church's authority and bolster its claim as the spiritual guide of humanity during a pivotal moment in God's plan. In addition to his religious motivations, Sylvester's scientific expertise is often cited as evidence of his involvement in the alleged scheme. As an accomplished astronomer, he would have been uniquely qualified to adjust astronomical records and manipulate the timeline in a way that appeared seamless. Proponents of the hypothesis argue that discrepancies in medieval astronomical records, such as mismatches between reported eclipses and modern calculations, may reflect Sylvester's handiwork in crafting a fabricated history. Critics, however, are quick to challenge this narrative. They argue that Sylvester II, while undoubtedly a brilliant scholar, had neither the motive nor the means to execute a fabrication of this scale. The logistical challenges of coordinating such a conspiracy across Europe and beyond would have been insurmountable, even for someone in Sylvester's position. Moreover, the accusation that he tampered with astronomical data lacks concrete evidence, as many of the discrepancies cited by proponents can be attributed to errors in observation or recording rather than deliberate manipulation. It's also worth noting that Sylvester II's legacy, though impressive, is not without controversy. His promotion of science and education in an era of superstition earned him both admiration and suspicion. While his association with the phantom time hypothesis is likely unfounded, it underscores the enduring fascination with his life and achievements. His role as a symbol of intellectual progress in a time often seen as stagnant makes him an easy target for myths and conspiracies. Whether Sylvester II was truly involved in the fabrication of 200 years or not, his place in this theory highlights the complex relationship between religion, science, and power in the Middle Ages. It also raises broader questions about how history is shaped by those who record it. Could one of history's most learned popes have conspired to rewrite the timeline, or is his association with the phantom time hypothesis merely a reflection of his enigmatic legacy? As with many aspects of the hypothesis, the truth remains elusive. What we do know is that Sylvester II's contributions to science and education had a lasting impact on the medieval world. Whether his name is tied to history or conspiracy, his story is a reminder of the powerful interplay between knowledge and influence in shaping the past. 3. Evidence against the hypothesis. 1. Arguments from mainstream historians. While the phantom time hypothesis captures the imagination, mainstream historians have consistently rejected it as a speculative and unfounded theory. Their counterarguments focus on several key areas. including the reliability of historical sources, archaeological evidence, and the sheer improbability of fabricating such a vast period of history. Let's delve into these objections to understand why the majority of scholars dismiss the hypothesis. First and foremost, historians argue that the phantom time hypothesis misunderstands the nature of medieval record-keeping. The Middle Ages, particularly the period between 614 and 911 AD, were marked by political instability, invasions, and social upheaval. These challenges inevitably affected the production and preservation of historical records. The so-called gaps or inconsistencies that proponents of the hypothesis point to are not unusual for this era. Rather, they reflect the chaotic nature of the time, instead of indicating a fabricated timeline. These gaps are seen as evidence of the limited resources and priorities of medieval chroniclers, who often focused on religious matters rather than detailed accounts of everyday events. Another critical argument centers around the volume and consistency of historical documents from the alleged phantom centuries. While it is true that fewer records survive from this period compared to later centuries, those that do exist show remarkable coherence across different regions and cultures. For instance, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic caliphates, and various European kingdoms all produced records that align with the established timeline. These independent accounts, written in different languages and for different purposes, corroborate the existence of events and individuals during the contested period. The idea that all these civilizations conspired to fabricate the same 200 years is not only improbable, but also unsupported by any evidence. Archaeological findings further undermine the phantom time hypothesis. Coins, tools, and structures dating to the phantom centuries have been discovered and authenticated using modern scientific techniques, such as radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology. For example, the Umayyad Caliphate, which flourished during this time, left behind an extensive legacy of architecture and artifacts, including the iconic Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. These tangible pieces of history provide a clear timeline that contradicts the idea of a fabricated period. Historians also point to the logistical challenges of executing such a widespread deception. Fabricating 200 years would require not only altering European records, but also manipulating timelines in other parts of the world. During the alleged phantom centuries, civilizations in Asia, the Americas, and Africa were independently developing their own histories, which show no evidence of missing or fabricated years. The coordination required to align these disparate timelines would have been nearly impossible, especially given the lack of global communication in the medieval era. Furthermore, mainstream historians highlight the motivations behind the hypothesis itself. Critics argue that the theory reflects a misunderstanding of medieval history, rather than a genuine anomaly. The idea of fabricated centuries appeals to those who view the Middle Ages as a dark and stagnant period. But this perception is increasingly being challenged by modern scholarship. Far from being an era of decline, the early Middle Ages were a time of significant cultural, technological, and religious transformation, as evidenced by the rise of Islamic science, Byzantine art, and European monasticism. Finally, historians emphasize the importance of scientific dating methods in confirming the established timeline. Techniques like radiocarbon dating have been used to analyze artifacts from the phantom centuries, consistently supporting their placement in history. For example, tree ring analysis dendrochronology has been used to date wooden structures and artifacts from this era, providing a precise and reliable chronological framework. These scientific methods leave little room for the kind of large-scale manipulation proposed by the phantom time hypothesis. In conclusion, mainstream historians argue that the phantom time hypothesis relies on cherry-picked anomalies and speculative interpretations rather than robust evidence. While it raises intriguing questions about how history is constructed, the overwhelming weight of historical, archaeological, and scientific evidence firmly supports the authenticity of the established timeline. For historians, the gaps and inconsistencies highlighted by proponents of the hypothesis are not signs of fabrication, but reminders of the challenges inherent in reconstructing the past. 2. Archaeological evidence contradicting the theory. One of the strongest rebuttals to the phantom time hypothesis comes from archaeology, a field that relies on physical evidence to reconstruct the past. Over the centuries, archaeologists have uncovered a wealth of artifacts, structures, and other tangible remnants from the so-called phantom centuries, directly contradicting the idea that this period was fabricated. These findings form a critical pillar of the mainstream historical timeline and offer compelling evidence against the hypothesis. Let's start with coins, which are some of the most reliable tools for dating historical periods. Coins minted during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries have been found across Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic Caliphates. These coins often bear the names and likenesses of rulers, along with dates and inscriptions, providing a clear chronological framework. For example, coins attributed to Charlemagne and his successors have been authenticated and dated using metallurgical analysis, aligning perfectly with the traditional timeline. The widespread circulation of these coins, from Northern Europe to the Mediterranean, reinforces their historical authenticity. Moving to architecture, numerous structures built during the alleged phantom centuries still stand today. One prominent example is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, constructed in 691 AD under the Umayyad Caliphate. This iconic structure is not only a masterpiece of Islamic architecture, but also a well-documented historical project, referenced in contemporary records and verified through archaeological studies. Similarly, the Palatine Chapel in Aachen, Germany, built by Charlemagne around 800 AD, represents a major achievement of Carolingian architecture. These buildings, along with others from the same period, provide irrefutable evidence of cultural and technological activity during the disputed era. Archaeological excavations of settlements and burial sites from the 7th to 9th centuries also offer a wealth of material evidence. These sites reveal insights into the daily lives of people during this time, including their tools, pottery, and agricultural practices. For instance, the Viking settlements in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, which date back to this period, have been extensively studied. Artifacts from these sites, such as weapons, jewelry, and ships, align with the traditional historical timeline and reflect the vibrant culture of the Viking Age. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, provides another powerful counterargument to the phantom time hypothesis. By analyzing the growth rings of ancient trees, scientists can create a precise chronological record that stretches back thousands of years. Wooden structures and artifacts from the 7th to 9th centuries have been dated using this method, confirming their placement within the established timeline. For example, wooden beams from medieval churches and ships have been analyzed and shown to originate from the disputed period, providing a natural and unalterable record of history. Radiocarbon dating also plays a critical role in debunking the hypothesis. This method, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic materials, has been used to date artifacts from the alleged phantom centuries. The results consistently support the traditional timeline. For example, textiles, manuscripts, and even bones from this period have been analyzed, all aligning with the historical chronology accepted by mainstream scholars. Another important counterpoint comes from continuity. In cultural and technological development, archaeological evidence shows a gradual progression in areas such as agriculture, metallurgy, and art during the disputed period. For instance, the evolution of farming tools and techniques can be traced through excavated sites, reflecting steady improvements rather than abrupt changes. That would suggest a fabricated timeline. Similarly, the development of artistic styles, such as the transition from late Roman to early medieval art, follows a clear trajectory supported by physical evidence. Critics of the phantom time hypothesis also highlight the logistical challenges of erasing or fabricating centuries of material culture. The archaeological record is vast and interconnected, with artifacts and sites from different regions and cultures corroborating each other. Manipulating this record on a large scale would require altering or destroying countless pieces of evidence, a task that would have been virtually impossible in the medieval era. In conclusion, the archaeological evidence from the 7th to 9th centuries overwhelmingly supports the authenticity of the established historical timeline. From coins and architecture to tree ring data and radiocarbon dating, the physical remnants of this period paint a vivid picture of life during the Middle Ages. While the phantom time hypothesis raises thought-provoking questions about the construction of history, the weight of archaeological findings leaves little room for doubt. The phantom centuries were very real, and their legacy is etched into the fabric of the past. 3. Scientific dating methods, dendrochronology, etc. Scientific dating methods, particularly dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating, provide some of the most compelling evidence against the phantom time hypothesis. These techniques allow researchers to independently verify the age of artifacts, structures, and organic materials, creating a timeline that is largely immune to human manipulation. Let's explore how these methods work and why they decisively challenge the idea of 200 fabricated years. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, is a precise method of determining the age of wooden objects and structures by analyzing the growth rings of trees. Each year, a tree adds a new ring to its trunk, and the size of the ring reflects environmental conditions such as rainfall and temperature. By comparing these rings to a master chronology, a database of tree ring patterns spanning thousands of years, scientists can pinpoint the exact year a tree was cut down. For the alleged phantom centuries, dendrochronology has provided a wealth of data. Wooden beams from medieval buildings, ships, and tools have been analyzed and dated to the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. For instance, the Viking longships discovered in Scandinavia, which date to this period, have been precisely dated using tree ring analysis. These findings align perfectly with the established historical timeline, leaving little room for the possibility of fabricated centuries. One notable example comes from the construction of early medieval churches in Europe. Many of these structures contain wooden beams that have been dendrochronologically dated to the alleged phantom period. The consistency of these dates across different regions, from Scandinavia to Central Europe, reinforces the authenticity of the timeline. If 200 years had been fabricated, we would expect significant gaps or anomalies in these records, yet none have been found. Radiocarbon dating, another widely used method, further undermines the phantom time hypothesis. This technique measures the decay of carbon-14 isotopes in organic materials, such as wood, bone, and textiles, to determine their age. Radiocarbon dating has been applied to numerous artifacts from the 7th to 9th centuries, including manuscripts, burial remains, and agricultural tools. The results consistently support the traditional historical timeline, with no evidence of a chronological void. For example, manuscripts from monastic libraries, such as the Book of Kells and other illuminated texts, have been radiocarbon dated to the early medieval period. These texts not only provide physical evidence of their age, but also contain references to historical figures and events that align with the established timeline. Similarly, burial sites excavated across Europe have yielded bones and grave goods that have been radiocarbon dated to the alleged phantom centuries. These findings offer a glimpse into the lives and cultures of people who lived during this period, further validating its historical reality. Scientific dating methods also play a crucial role in cross-referencing different types of evidence. For instance, dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating have been used together to analyze the same artifacts, providing independent confirmation of their age. In cases where discrepancies arise, they are often small and attributable to calibration issues or environmental factors rather than deliberate manipulation. This consistency across methods adds another layer of credibility to the established timeline. Critics of the phantom time hypothesis point out that these scientific techniques are immune to the kind of large-scale tampering suggested by the theory. While historical documents can be altered or fabricated, the physical properties of materials, such as the isotopic composition of carbon or the growth patterns of trees, cannot be easily manipulated. These methods offer an objective measure of time that transcends human biases and agendas. It's also worth noting that scientific dating methods have been applied to artifacts from outside Europe, in regions unaffected by the alleged conspiracy. For instance, artifacts from the Islamic caliphates, East Asia, and the Americas have been independently dated, and show no evidence of missing or fabricated years. This global consistency further undermines the hypothesis, as it suggests that the established timeline is accurate across diverse cultures and regions. In conclusion, scientific dating methods provide a powerful rebuttal to the phantom time hypothesis. Techniques like dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating offer precise and objective tools for verifying the age of artifacts and structures, consistently supporting the authenticity of the traditional historical timeline. While the hypothesis raises intriguing questions about the construction of history, the hard evidence provided by these methods leaves little doubt. The phantom centuries were real, and their legacy is firmly rooted in the physical record of the past. Conclusion 1. Summarize both sides of the debate. The debate surrounding the phantom time hypothesis is a fascinating clash of ideas, pitting bold speculation against well-established evidence. On one side, proponents of the theory present a daring narrative that 200 years of history, stretching from 614 to 911 AD, were fabricated to serve political and religious agendas. On the other side, mainstream historians and scientists counter with a robust defense of the established timeline, grounded in a wealth of archaeological, documentary, and scientific evidence. To fully appreciate this debate, let's delve deeper into the arguments on both sides. Proponents of the hypothesis argue that the Middle Ages contain an extraordinary anomaly. They claim that the years in question lack sufficient historical documentation, cultural development, or technological innovation to justify their inclusion in the timeline. For example, they highlight the so-called Dark Ages, a term often associated with a period of stagnation following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Supporters of the hypothesis assert that this perceived stagnation is not natural, but a result of missing or fabricated years. They point to figures like Charlemagne, a central figure in European history, and question whether his achievements were real or mythologized to fill the gap in history. Astronomical discrepancies also feature prominently in their case. By analyzing medieval descriptions of celestial events, such as solar eclipses and planetary alignments, proponents claim to have identified inconsistencies with modern astronomical models. They argue that these discrepancies hint at deliberate adjustments to the historical timeline. For instance, certain eclipses recorded in medieval chronicles do not align with the astronomical data we would expect if those events had occurred during the claimed years. To proponents, this is evidence of a deliberate manipulation of time. Equally important are the motives they attribute to the alleged conspirators. Supporters of the hypothesis contend that Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II orchestrated the fabrication to align their reigns with the year 1000 AD, a year rich with apocalyptic and religious significance. By positioning themselves as leaders during this pivotal moment, they could enhance their authority and reinforce their legitimacy as divinely chosen rulers. However, critics of the hypothesis argue that these claims collapse under closer scrutiny. Mainstream historians emphasize that the gaps and inconsistencies highlighted by proponents are neither unusual nor suspicious. They point out that the early Middle Ages were a time of political instability, frequent invasions, and limited record-keeping infrastructure. The resulting gaps in documentation are a natural consequence of these circumstances, not evidence of a fabricated timeline. Furthermore, critics note that the historical record from this period is far more robust than the hypothesis suggests. Independent civilizations, such as the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, and various European kingdoms, produced a wealth of documents, artifacts, and architectural achievements that align with the traditional timeline. These records, written in different languages and serving different purposes, consistently corroborate the existence of the phantom centuries. Archaeological evidence provides another decisive counterargument. Coins bearing the likenesses of rulers, monumental buildings, like the Dome of the Rock, and countless artifacts unearthed from burial sites and settlements all point to the vibrancy of life during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. Scientific dating methods, such as dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating, further validate these findings. Critics argue that these methods provide an objective and reliable measure of time, one that is immune to the kind of manipulation proposed by the hypothesis. The global perspective also undermines the theory. During the alleged phantom centuries, civilizations outside of Europe, such as those in Asia, the Americas, and Africa, were independently developing their own histories. The consistency of their timelines with those of Europe suggests that the proposed fabrication is not only improbable but virtually impossible. Ultimately, the debate boils down to a tension between skepticism and evidence. Proponents of the hypothesis challenge us to reconsider our assumptions about history, raising provocative questions about how it is recorded and interpreted. However, mainstream historians maintain that the hypothesis relies on speculative interpretations and ignores the overwhelming weight of evidence that confirms the authenticity of the established timeline. In this clash of perspectives, one thing is clear. The phantom time hypothesis forces us to confront the complexities of historical research. It highlights the challenges of piecing together the past and the need for constant inquiry and critical thinking. Whether viewed as an audacious conspiracy theory or a fascinating mental exercise, the hypothesis serves as a reminder of the ever-evolving nature of historical understanding. 2. Reflect on the plausibility of the hypothesis. When we step back and reflect on the plausibility of the phantom time hypothesis, it's clear that the idea poses some profound questions about the nature of historical truth. Could 200 years of history really have been fabricated? To answer this, we must weigh the theory's core claims against the practical, logistical, and evidentiary challenges it faces. At first glance, the hypothesis is undeniably intriguing. It offers a bold explanation for the perceived gaps in the historical record, a narrative that resonates with the common notion of the Middle Ages as a stagnant and under-documented era. The idea that such a large portion of history could be manipulated by powerful figures like Otto III and Pope Sylvester II taps into a broader fascination with conspiracy theories, particularly those involving the manipulation of knowledge by elite groups. However, the plausibility of this theory quickly diminishes under closer scrutiny. One of the most significant challenges to its credibility is the sheer scale of the alleged fabrication. The hypothesis requires not only the rewriting of European history, but also the synchronization of this fabricated timeline with records from other civilizations. During the proposed phantom centuries, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, and even regions beyond Europe were producing independent records that align with the traditional timeline. The coordination necessary to alter or fabricate all these records would have been monumental, if not impossible, especially given the limited communication and technological capabilities of the medieval world. Another major hurdle lies in the physical evidence that contradicts the hypothesis. As we've explored, archaeological discoveries provide a rich tapestry of material culture from the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. Coins bearing the names of rulers, buildings like the Dome of the Rock, and artifacts from Viking settlements offer tangible proof that these centuries were not only real but vibrant and dynamic. Scientific dating methods, such as dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating, independently confirm the age of these artifacts, leaving little room for doubt about their authenticity. From a practical standpoint, the logistics of such a grand-scale manipulation are staggering. The hypothesis posits that Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and their Byzantine counterparts conspired to fabricate 200 years of history to align their reigns with the year 1000 AD. While this might serve as a compelling narrative, the feasibility of implementing this scheme across an entire continent, let alone influencing records in the Islamic world or East Asia, strains credibility. Historians argue that medieval Europe lacked the centralized control and infrastructure necessary to coordinate such an operation, let alone execute it without leaving traces of the forgery. There is also the question of motive. While the desire to associate their reigns with a symbolically significant year like 1000 AD might explain the actions of Otto III and Sylvester II, it does not account for the broader historical continuity observed during the phantom centuries. The cultural, technological, and religious developments of this period fit naturally within the larger arc of history, suggesting a gradual evolution rather than a fabricated gap. Critics of the hypothesis also highlight the danger of projecting modern skepticism onto the past. While it's important to question historical narratives, the phantom time hypothesis relies heavily on cherry-picked anomalies and speculative interpretations, often ignoring the overwhelming evidence that supports the traditional timeline. This approach risks undermining the rigor of historical research, replacing it with a narrative driven more by intrigue than by evidence. That said, the hypothesis does serve an important function. It challenges us to think critically about the construction of history. How do we know what we know about the past? How much trust should we place in historical records, And what happens when those records are incomplete or contradictory? While the phantom time hypothesis may not be plausible, it reminds us of the complexities inherent in reconstructing the past, and the importance of remaining open to new interpretations. In the end, the plausibility of the phantom time hypothesis appears slim, given the weight of evidence against it. However, its value lies not in its accuracy, but in the questions it raises about history, power, and the control of knowledge. By engaging with such theories, we gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges historians face and the tools they use to uncover the truth. 3. Ask the audience, could history be altered, or is this just a conspiracy? As we conclude our deep dive into the phantom time hypothesis, we're left with a question that lingers far beyond this specific theory. Could history itself be so malleable that entire centuries could be fabricated? It's a startling thought, one that challenges our faith in the records of the past. Yet, as we've explored today, history is rarely a perfect, objective account of events. It's a collection of stories, interpretations, and evidence, each shaped by the biases, agendas, and limitations of the people who recorded them. For example, imagine how much power lies in the hands of those who control historical narratives. Throughout history, leaders, conquerors, and religious institutions have rewritten or erased aspects of the past to suit their needs. The ancient Egyptians famously defaced monuments to erase the memory of rival pharaohs. In more modern times, propaganda and censorship have been used to shape collective memory, both during wartime and in periods of political upheaval. With this in mind, the idea of historical manipulation isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem. But does this mean the phantom time hypothesis could be true? As we've seen, the evidence against it is overwhelming. The consistency of archaeological finds, scientific dating methods, and independent historical records from across the globe make it highly unlikely that an entire 200 years of history could have been fabricated. Yet, the theory raises important questions about the trustworthiness of historical accounts and the nature of the gaps we encounter in the historical record. Think about it. How much of history do we take for granted simply because it's written in textbooks or taught in schools? How often do we question the sources, the methods, and the people behind the narratives we accept as fact? This is where the value of engaging with theories like the phantom time hypothesis truly lies. Not necessarily in proving or disproving them, but in prompting us to think critically about the past. As we reflect on this mystery, let's consider the broader implications. If even a portion of the hypothesis were true, it would change our understanding of the Middle Ages, the development of civilizations, and even the progression of human history itself. What other gaps or anomalies in history might deserve closer examination? Could there be smaller, subtler manipulations of history that have gone unnoticed, shaping the way we see the past in ways we don't yet understand? And now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the phantom time hypothesis? Does it hold any merit? Or is it simply a thought-provoking conspiracy? Do you think history as we know it is vulnerable to manipulation, or is the weight of evidence too strong to ignore? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Additionally, if you're intrigued by this topic, let us know which historical mysteries you'd like us to tackle next. From lost civilizations and ancient artifacts to unexplained disappearances and bizarre events, the past is full of questions waiting to be answered. Together, let's continue exploring the enigmas of history and uncovering the secrets that make it so fascinating. History is not just about the past, it's about how we understand ourselves today. And every question, no matter how wild, brings us one step closer to the truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey. into one of history's most intriguing mysteries, the phantom time hypothesis. As we wrap up, we want to hear from you. Your insights and ideas are what make this community of history enthusiasts so special. So let's dive into what you think. Do you believe it's possible for 200 years of history to have been fabricated? Or do you think the evidence against the hypothesis is too overwhelming to ignore? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Whether you agree with the mainstream historical perspective, or find yourself intrigued by the possibility of hidden truths, we'd love to hear your take. After all, history is full of debates, and your voice is an important part of the conversation. But don't stop there. If this video sparked your curiosity, let us know which other historical mysteries you'd like us to explore. Perhaps you're fascinated by the lost city of Atlantis, the secrets of ancient Egyptian technology, or the mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colony. Or maybe you want to dive into lesser-known enigmas, like the Antikythera mechanism or the Voynich manuscript. Whatever piques your interest, we're here to investigate and bring these mysteries to life. We also encourage you to think about the broader themes raised by this video. The phantom time hypothesis may or may not hold water, but it opens the door to deeper questions. How reliable is history? How much of what we know has been shaped by the biases of those who recorded it? And what does this mean for our understanding of ourselves and the world around us? Reflect on these questions, and feel free to share your insights. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay up to date on all our latest explorations into history's greatest mysteries. Plus, hitting that notification bell ensures you'll never miss an upload. Because who knows what fascinating puzzle we'll uncover next. And finally, if you want to support our work, consider sharing this video with friends and family who love history as much as you do. The more people we can engage in these conversations, the closer we come to unraveling the secrets of the past. Together, we can build a community of curious minds, united by a passion for uncovering the truth. History is a story we're all a part of, and every question brings us closer to understanding it. So, keep asking, keep exploring, and keep challenging what you think you know. The past is full of mysteries, and the best part? The answers might be closer than we think. If you found this video helpful or interesting, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.